Hello, welcome to Thor Talk, the show all about Marvel's resident god of thunder. On this episode of Thor Talk, the moon is a battlefield for thunder gods. Thor and his newly formed Thor Corps now face Tornos, the elder god of thunder, the Utgard Thor. Tornos is far more powerful, but Thor has a plan that will involve using the full power of Thor and giving up Mjolnir. We'll see if he'll succeed on Thor Talk.
I am Thor the Thunderer, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, and this world is under my protection.
The Immortal Thor number 5 was written by Al Ewing and was published in December of 2023. This time, the issue doesn't open with a stanza from a Norse poem, but instead a stanza from a medieval song, found in a collection known as Carmina Burana. This is the last stanza in the poem Fortune Plango Vulnera, and this is it translated into English. The wheel of fortune spins. One man is abased by its descent, the other is carried aloft. All too exalted sits the king at the top. Let him beware ruin. The poem describes the Rota Fortunae, or the Wheel of Fortune, which is spun by Fortuna, the Roman goddess of fortune and fate. When she spins the wheel, people at the top may wind up at the bottom, and vice versa. Their place on the wheel determines whether they have good or bad fortune. One man is carried up into good fortune, while the next is cast down into bad fortune. This changing of one's fortunes can happen randomly and at any time. Even the king, who sits at the top of the wheel, must beware being cast down to the bottom. This stanza was chosen for a number of reasons. First is the obvious connection between the Wheel of Fortune and Tornos' own Wheel of Fate. Secondly is the fact that we find out in this story that the gods are in some sort of cycle, just as the Wheel of Fortune traps everyone within a cycle of changing fortunes. Finally, the mention of the king sitting at the top who should beware ruin could apply to both Thor and Tornos. Tornos thought himself far greater than Thor, and victory seemed inevitable, but he will soon find his fortunes turn. Thor, meanwhile, finds himself at the top of the wheel when he defeats Tornos at the end of the issue, but he should beware ruin, since there are more threats coming who are eager to change his fortunes again. On the dark side of the moon, there was light. An elder god had pitted his wrath against Gaia's child, a god with the wheel of fate in his hand, and the wheel had turned. The wheel is turning. The wheel readies to turn. Understand ye yet, or what? All this has happened before, and happens now again. Behold, Demiurge. Demiurge primordial, the god creator, gazed upon the earth as it was in formation, and brought forth aspects of itself, brought forth gods, a god of deep magic, of the wheel, of life. The elder gods emerged, and were the first to gaze upon the earth, and the first to gaze upon each other, upon their siblings, upon their foes. Iron fate could not exist alongside the Trickmaker, and so the war of the elder gods began. Back and forth the battle went, creating endlessly repeating cycles, which then returned to the beginning. Only she who would be known as Gaia saw the meaningless cycle for what it was. Earth would not survive this. Life would not survive this. Unless she taught a new cycle. She began to plan. Now her own son beheld the fruits of her labor. The story of the birth, war, and fall of the Elder Gods was also told in Thor Annual number 10 and Silver Surfer Annual number 2, though there are a few key differences here. First of all is the obvious fact that Tornos and Utgard Loki are here in this version of the story, which of course makes sense since they only made their debut a few issues ago. Though this new version of the story does make sure to include some of the other beings who were in the original, such as Set and Gaia. I did really like the idea that Tornos, a being of order, looked at Utgard Loki, a trickster who defies order, and immediately decided to make war with this opposing idea. Though this is yet another change, as the War of the Elder Gods didn't start until they had already established themselves over Earth for millions of years, and it is Set who starts the war by committing the first murder. Almost all of the Elder Gods then go to war and devolve into demons. It's possible that this is not a retcon, as the narration does say that they were trapped in a cycle. This cycle could be something akin to Ragnarok with death and rebirth, which would explain the differences, or it could just be describing the cycle of needless violence that occurred. Speaking of cycles, we hear that Gaia has made a new cycle in order to stop the old one. In the original story, Gaia ends the war by giving birth to Atum, the first of a new generation of gods. Atum then annihilates the Elder God demons and becomes Demogorge, the God Eater. Given that we've already heard this story, I seriously doubt that this new cycle that was teased is just the creation of Atum. It is possible that he's part of the cycle, or maybe he was a way to clear the board to start a new one. Whenever I think of Thor and cycles, my mind immediately jumps to Ragnarok. Is this new cycle related to the cycle of Ragnarok? Did Gaia create the cycle of Ragnarok? It's definitely possible that that's where this is going, but obviously, I don't know. Somewhere, Gaia felt the wheel turning, as her son and his forces used his power to battle Tornos. Jane Foster strikes the Elder God with Mjolnir's lightning, and then throws the hammer to Loki. But each only has 60 seconds until the power wears off, so Loki tosses it to Storm. Each member of the Thor Corps uses Mjolnir to strike Tornos, and then throws the hammer to the next person. Tornos is annoyed at these stinging gnats, until he throws the Wheel of Fate at them, and Jane Foster throws Mjolnir to meet it. The wheel cracks. This was the power of Mjolnir, the Crusher, greatest of all hammers. It was eager to rend the skull of a titan. Tornos knew that Thor was emitting a final truth. He had yet to taste the hammer's greatest power, and each strike caused him to want that hidden power even more. The hammer comes to Loki, who admits that he has missed getting to throw Mjolnir at a Thunder God's face. Beta Ray Bill tries to stop him, but he's too late. Tornos catches the hammer. "The hammer is mine," roars the old storm god. Soon the power of Thor fades from the Thor Corps, with the hammer still in Tornos' hand. But how, Bill wonders, how can he even lift the enchanted hammer? The reasons are simple indeed, Bill. Tornos, I judge you worthy of the power of Thor. And so it was. The ancient storm meets the new, as Tornos now wields the power of Thor, and prepares to annihilate the earth. Before you embark on that noble goal, great Tornos, I have but one question for thee. Answer if you can. What is the power of Thor? It is then that Tornos feels it. He trembles as he feels it in his very core, his very soul. When they called to me in ancient times, as rain lashed and lightning struck, as the roof fell in and the longboat capsized, what power did they invoke? Did they wish the storm to rage on, more terrible each moment than the last? I say thee, nay. The power of Thor is the power to hold the storm back. And my greatest power is knowledge of how to use my power well. With compassion, with restraint, with nobility, with hard-won wisdom, and most of all, with humility. The power of Thor is the power to be worthy. If I may grant that power, then you, Tornos, deserve it more than any, for yours is surely the greatest need. Tornos screams in horror and begs that Thor take the hammer back. But what has been seen cannot be unseen. His heart burns and screams. His sins are a crown of torments upon his head. His soul is tortured for doing what he was commanded to do by Utgard Loki and by Thor's mother Gaia. Somewhere, Gaia felt the winter's cold, as Thor then learned the truth. Thor roars at Tornos and demands an explanation, but Tornos is already gone. Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. Thor's journey in issue 3 has caused him to examine himself and his power more closely than ever before. To ask the question, what is the power of Thor? Thor decides that it is the power to hold the storm back, the power to be worthy. It's an interesting way of looking at it. From the beginning, the power of Thor and worthiness have been intrinsically linked. Mjolnir has only ever bestowed the power of Thor to those who are worthy. However, unlike with other heroes, Mjolnir is not a separate entity that Thor draws someone else's power from, but is instead a part of Thor, and his worthiness allows him to fully access his own power because worthiness is part of who Thor is. At his core, both in myth and Marvel, Thor is and has always been a protector. Someone who has great power and who chooses to use that power well by protecting others. That's not to say that Thor cannot exist only as a hero and protector, but when he abandons this role, he abandons a crucial part of himself, and he loses his power with it. With Thor being the Allfather, he is now in control of the worthiness enchantment, and he determines that Toranos is worthy. We've never really seen anything like this. Toranos doesn't bypass the enchantment, and he wasn't already worthy. Thor said that Toranos was worthy, and so he became worthy. It's an interesting idea. This also goes hand in hand with Thor's power being linked to worthiness, which was essential to Thor's plan. He assembled a new Thor core to show Toranos the power of Thor and get him to want it for himself. When Toranos at last attempted to claim the hammer's greatest power, Thor gave it to him and then forced him to have a conscience. Now that he was a being with compassion, restraint, nobility, wisdom, and humility, he was tormented with the guilt over what he had done. He was now someone with the qualities of a protector, with the qualities of Thor, who used his power to do harm to innocents. The steps that Thor takes in his plan show that this strategy can only work if the opponent wants the full power of Thor. Otherwise, Thor wouldn't need the Thor core and could just put the hammer in Toranos' hand. So don't expect him to go around the universe reforming villains by jamming Mjolnir into their hands. Though, with all that being said, I have to admit I have some rather mixed feelings about how the conflict with Toranos ended. On one hand, it was good to see Thor defeat him in such a clever way. He reaches deep within himself and examines his own power in order to find a way to defeat Toranos. On the other hand, the ending does feel a bit anticlimactic. It reminds me a lot of how the Black Winter was handled in Donny Cates' first Thor arc. Both villains are built up as these incredibly powerful deities who are completely on a different level. But despite that, they end up being defeated pretty quickly, and a new threat is set up immediately after. I feel like Toranos' quick defeat made more sense than the Black Winter's, and was better overall. But despite that, it's hard to imagine this first arc really standing the test of time. It feels like it's just a small part of a much bigger story, as opposed to a story that can stand on its own. And that's fair enough. Again, it's not bad by any means. Toranos will definitely show up later, but having this villain that was so heavily hyped up be defeated in 5 issues feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. Also, I am curious if Toranos will keep his conscience, or if it's something that will wear off over time. Thor's plan worked, but Storm questions if she really needed to be there for it. Thor wanted to have heroes he felt would best wield Mjolnir in order to make Toranos want the hammer, but he still apologizes for taking her away from her own war, and offers to fight in it. Storm says that his involvement may be considered an insult, so she just asks for transportation, and since she needs to make a heroic entrance, she wants to wear Thor's cape. If you're wondering what happens next with Storm, we actually saw that happen way back in X-Men Red number 14, when Storm rejoins the battle in Thor's cape to turn the tide. This issue actually came out a week before the very first issue of The Immortal Thor, so Ewing has apparently been planning decently far ahead. With Storm sent back, Thor again apologizes to Beta Ray Bill for his failures as a friend, but Bill believes that their relationship is healing, and suggests that next time, Thor should wield Bill's weapon in battle. This was a nice moment, and I liked that Ewing is still dedicated to repairing the relationship. As Bill is sent off, Jane needs to share news from Valhalla. Odin warned her not to say anything, but there have been nightmares in heaven of a dark fate linked to Mjolnir, that a warrior holding it will soon meet their end. Thor then resolves to not let the hammer out of his grip again, and thanks Jane for telling him. First of all, I really liked this little moment from Thor where he hears that Mjolnir's wielder is doomed, and the main thing he takes away from this is that he shouldn't let anyone else have it again, since he would put them in danger. The events that Jane is describing took place in Avengers Incorporated number 3, which was also written by Ewing. Way back in Thor number 362, Thor was going to sacrifice himself and stay behind to hold off the armies of the dead. However, Scourge knocked Thor out and took his place. Scourge took a death meant for Thor, but in Valhalla he felt that death seek out Thor, and had dreams of Thor facing his end on a bridge with a hammer and axe in hand. This is the same scene that was teased in our very first preview way back in the 2023 Thor Annual. Scourge took this news to Odin, and Odin used a special backdoor method to get Scourge out of Valhalla so he could prevent Thor's death. Now Scourge the Executioner meets with Dario Agger. Scourge wishes to prevent his dream of Thor's death from occurring, and he heard that Agger now possesses the rights to Thor's legend. They agree to an alliance and are joined in their partnership by Scourge's friend, Amora the Enchantress. So Amora and Scourge are reunited at last, but it seems they are no longer masters of evil. Scourge is on a mission to prevent Thor's death, and the Enchantress seems to share the same goal. As a side note, it really is interesting how varied Amora's alignment can be. She was very recently one of the main villains in the War of the Realms, but I have no problem believing that she is on the side of good this time because of how often she's been an ally. Overall, I once again really enjoyed this issue. It offered some interesting insights and teases, but admittedly the ending could have been more satisfying. Though still, we got to see the War of the Elder Gods, Tornos with the power of Thor, the Enchantress and her Executioner reunited, and Thor defeating his foe with his intelligence and power. Martin Cuccolo has yet to disappoint in the art department, and Ewing continues to keep me invested in the story moving forward. Well, that's all for this episode of Thor Talk. I hope you all enjoyed it. I apologize it's a bit later than usual. I've unfortunately been busy with other things, a lot of it related to the holidays, as I'm sure everyone is. Speaking of which, happy holidays, Merry Christmas to everyone, or as we say in Old Norse, Gleðileg jól. Well, with that being said, see you next time on Thor Talk, where...
You'll be holding